Words matter. In our world today, we use words in order to communicate ideas, in order to share feelings, in order to gain knowledge. But we can also use words to wound and weaponize against those we disagree with. In fact, today, political ideology has driven an intentional misuse of words and a conflict over how we even understand shared ideas. Things like, what is a woman, or are you using my preferred pronouns, have become common parlance in a lot of the war on ideas today. Are Christians homophobic, bigoted people, or is Christian nationalism an actual thing? All of these things trade on specific ideas and understandings of words. Hi everyone, this is Lenny with Come Let Us Reason. This week I'm presenting a topic at our Dare to Defend conference, which is an apologetics event we have every year. And our podcast today brings you last year's talk that I offered called Beware the Language Games of the Woke. In it, I explain we need to deftly recognize and expose the language shell games that are sometimes used by certain social justice warriors to try and shame and coerce us into holding a specific view. However, through a proper approach of engaging and extending the ideas that sometimes accompany these words, we can open a door to gospel conversations. It's both a caution as well as an opportunity for you to go out and change the direction of the conversation to one of Jesus. So I hope you enjoy this podcast. And if you're interested in our Dare to Defend conferences, all of them are recorded on video and won't be available on this channel. But if you go to comereason.org/dare to defend, you can sign up and watch all of the different conference speakers and topics that we've had in the past few years. So with no further ado, I bring you Beware the Language Games of the Woke.
Well, I wanted to tell you a little story first. This is kind of an anecdote that's probably not historically true, but there was a point at which the Jewish people were not highly valued in the Catholic Church. And the story goes in the early medieval period that the Pope wanted to come out and expel all the Jews from Vatican City. Now, they had a problem because the Jewish people didn't speak Latin, and the Pope, of course, doesn't speak anything like Hebrew. So there was a communication issue. But what the Pope did was he said, well, what we'll do is we'll challenge their leading rabbi to a debate in order to see whether they are worthy of staying in the Vatican or not. Now, everybody comes out for this. The cardinals are all dressed in their attire, and the Jewish contingent, of course, is on pins and needles to see what's going to happen. And all they could do was signal to one another. So the Pope holds up 3 fingers, and the rabbi holds up 1 finger. The Pope circles around his head. The rabbi points to the ground. Finally, in exasperation, the Pope pulls out the wafer and the wine chalice, and the rabbi produces an apple. And the Pope throws up his hands, turns to his cardinals and says, this rabbi is too good. I can't beat him in a debate. The Jews must stay. Now, everybody was mystified, like, what just happened? And the Pope said, well, I held up 3 fingers to signify the Trinity. He held up 1 finger to signify that there is a common God between our 2 people. But I said Christianity has encircled the world. And he says, yes, but God has placed us here in this place for this purpose. I showed him the sacrifice of the Eucharist, and he came back and reminded me of the sin of the Garden of Eden. Every objection I had to us being incompatible, he answered. Now, on the Jewish side, they had the same question. So the rabbi explained, well, he said that you have 3 days to leave. We said, we're not leaving one person behind. Because you have to get out of the entire city. And I said, no, we're staying right here. Well, what happened next? I don't know. He got out his lunch, I got out mine. Language is important. That little silly story hopefully shows that we need language to communicate. Now, by the way, if you want to keep in touch, you can do so. I am on all kinds of social media. You can find me on Facebook, but basically anything -come reason. So if you want to follow all of these things and see what's going on, you can do so. Also, you can get these slides. Of course, we're going to send all this to you, so you don't really have to worry about this. But if somebody wants to get the slides, they can sign up for the email by doing it that way. I wanted to start off by talking about the book of Judges. The book of Judges is an interesting era in the life of ancient Israel. It's a time where there was no leader, and it's a time where there was a lot of infighting, even between the tribes of Israel. Of course, it's famously understood as the time where everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There's no common thread of morality. They weren't following the laws of God. They were following what they thought they should do. And you see scene after scene of carnage or Israel falling into oppression, being attacked, and then having to raise a judge in order to bring them out of that. 400 years of this. One interesting example is found in Judges chapter 12, where the judge Jephthah had asked the Ephraimites, one of the 12 tribes, to come out and fight alongside him against the dreaded Ammonites. They refused. They kind of turned him down. He went out. He conquered them. But then afterwards, when you're, collecting all the booty and things like that, they came back to him and said, hey, you didn't invite us to come. What's up with that? That's a loose paraphrase. Jephthah said, look, you guys don't get to cross over into our border. You don't get to have any of the spoil because you refused this. This is ridiculous. And they put up guards. And as you can see from this little amazingly skilled diagram, that some guys would want to come across and take part of the booty. And they would say, well, are you an Ephraimite or are you one of our friends who helped us? Oh, he would say, I'm an Ephraimite. But Judges 12:5-6 says they would have a question. Well, if you're an Ephraimite, or if you're not an Ephraimite, you say the word Shibboleth. Because Shibboleth, the Ephraimites kind of had a linguistic hook. Maybe think of a Texas drawl or something like that, where they couldn't say the SH well. So their language gave them away. And they were easily identified by the fact that they spoke this in a certain way. Since then, the word shibboleth has become in popular parlance a way of identifying a specific position. There are various shibboleths in the world. Some would say MAGA, Make America Great Again, is a shibboleth. It tells you who you voted for, perhaps. Or here's one that became popular a few years ago, Black Lives Matter. Now, this exploded in 2015 after the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the murder of Trayvon Martin. It was developed by a Los Angeles activist, and then it took hold. And it became so big that people were demanding others say Black Lives Matter. Say Black Lives Matter. And there was a pushback. People, well, all lives matter. Now, this confrontation is very much, in my estimation, like the Pope and the rabbi. They're saying the same words to each other, but their meanings are so completely different that they're not communicating at all. In fact, author Jason, what was his name now? Jason Reynolds responded to this because there were many news articles talking about why you shouldn't say all lives matter. He said, my life matters. And if you say, no, all lives matter, what I would say is, I believe that you believe all lives matter. I don't doubt that. But because I live the life that I live, I'm certain that in this country, all lives don't matter. I know for a fact that based on the numbers, my life hasn't mattered. Now, you may quibble with his statistics, but realize that's what he's hearing. And this is the first important point. In this, we have to be very careful when approaching language because we don't want to do that which we're decrying. Okay? So that's point number one. A person had drawn the analogy to me this way. If I tell you I'm worried about my wife's life, I'm worried about my friend's life because my friend has cancer, and I'm worried about, I want her life to matter, or if you're on your deathbed diagnosed, I want my life to matter. If someone says, well, all lives matter, how do you understand that? That's a problem, right? That's what a lot of folks heard. So we have two groups of people talking about the same three words and understanding them in two separate ways. Now, I'll get back to this at the end of my talk. And part of what I'm going to do first is explain to you what language does, how it works, why it's important that we talk about our choice of words. Secondly, how in our modern era we have moved from trying to communicate, making an effort to communicate between individuals, onto trying to propagandize each other. And then thirdly, how we as Christians can avoid those traps and possibly make a better case by being a little bit more thoughtful. So first of all, let's talk about words. I think we have to be distinguishing between what is language and what is loaded language. Now, language, as I said, it's the primary medium of thought. When we dream in words. When we have ideas, they're in words. It's universal. And by the way, language is uniquely human. David Adger makes the argument that there's something specific in language to human beings, specifically grammar. Coco, the ape, in signing things like that, that's basically symbolic representation. That's the same as training an animal to hold up a red sign to get a banana. If you train them to hold their fingers in a certain way to get a banana, you get the same result. Language isn't simply a complex string of symbols because there's grammar that's involved. And they have found that even in households, say, of hearing parents in poor nations, like Nicaragua is the primary example, where they have multiple children who are born deaf, the children not only create their own sign language to communicate with one another, but they create their own grammar within that sign language. There's a certain way that you say things. And even though the parents kind of get the symbols, the parents never pick up the grammar the way the other children do. So, communication deals with abstract concepts, with complex ideas. These are the goals of language, to be able to transfer the things that I'm thinking and understanding to someone else. And that's why we have to be sensitive to the reception of these things. It does matter how words are perceived, as well as how they're delivered, right? How many of you have heard the following sentence? Don't take that tone with me. How many of you have had kids? How many of you were a kid? Exactly. How we see ourselves, our situation, how we understand reality is all communicated through language. You are getting a bombardment of sentences this weekend. And it's all done, all the information that you're understanding is via language. Thus, if you change the language, you can change the perception. That seems to be fair. There's an idea that linguists talk about called the euphemism treadmill. Now, this was first identified by Sharon Henderson Taylor, called the euphemism cycle in 1974. The term euphemism treadmill was coined by Steven Pinker. And it's really an interesting concept, and we're all probably haven't realized it, but are more or less familiar with it. And what it is a euphemism is something that you use. It's kind of a nice word to put in place of a word that you really wouldn't want to say, right? So usually it's done by somebody who doesn't want to offend. Bathroom references, for example, are this. We would say, originally, bathrooms were referred to as latrines. And the problem, though, is when you talk about latrine, you got that reference to, everybody identified it with the action of going to the bathroom. And what happens is that word now has a negative connotation. It takes on an aura to it that is a little bit distasteful. So somebody substitutes another word, water closet, instead of latrine. The French, not satisfied with that, because after a while, the usage of water closet, guess what? You're still using it for the same purpose. So it still gets associated with the action. So the French change it up again. Well, let's call it toilette, because toilet just means any kind of personal attachment, any kind of personal, dealings. So you have toiletries that you buy at the store. So that could be makeup, that could be hair care products. It's all those kinds of things. So if we say toilet, it just means personal care. Well, we don't normally, in America at least, we say it's rude to say go to the toilet. So then we go to bathroom and then restroom. And this is the euphemism treadmill. What happens is every time you create a euphemism for something, because the item, the idea itself, whatever you're referring to, well, that hasn't changed. And if that has a negative connotation, sooner or later the euphemism will have a negative connotation as well. So let's look at a couple. Intellectual disabilities. This is a common point. Historically, there were 3 medical classifications for specific grades of lowered IQ. Those were imbecile, idiot, and moron. Those were actually scientific terms at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, you all react to that, right? Because we call people an imbecile and an idiot or a moron. So, idiot dates back to the 14th century, and imbeciles from the 16th. They're old terms, but they were used in specific classifications. People balked at it. Mentally handicapped. They switched the term in the 60s. But people started using handicapped. I don't know. Handicapped was considered then derogatory. Intellectual disabilities started being used. Similarly, mental retardation for just any type of mental slowness. I mean, that's what retard means, right? To retard growth is to slow it down. Doesn't mean that you can't grow, but because retard comes into the common vernacular, it becomes an insult. So we use special. He's special. Everybody's telling me this is such a special conference. That worries me. Exceptional, unique, distinctive. But that word got criticized as patronizing. So it's thrown out. People with disabilities want to be treated as equals, not as special. We see it in race, right? Negro is the Spanish word for black. So we had originally referred to people of black, but in the 60s, they felt that in the race culture discussions, it was a little bit more ambiguous. It was disconnecting equality. Well, if you have white, then you should have black. White and black. Then Afro-American, African-American. Now we're back to black. You see the problem. And even the word order matters. We can talk about people of color. Can we talk about colored people? Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting how that little change makes a huge difference? Does the term invalid really mean that you are invalid? The way people would argue that it does. The euphemism treadwell becomes a problem. But a lot of that is natural and organic in its origin. What concerns me is the loaded language, the rise of propaganda, language that is used to sway a position instead of simply communicate. Now, let me give you the definition of propaganda. This is from the Oxford English Dictionary: a systematic dissemination of information, especially in a biased or misleading way, in order to promote a political cause or a point of view. Notice there's a motive here. It's not understanding, it's promotion, which is the big hook. Propaganda as a political tool did not come into popular parlance until the 20th century, and the Third Reich was probably one of the primary, the Third Reich and the Soviet Union both, were big pushers of, matter of fact, Hitler thought that the Germans lost World War I because the British were better at propagandizing their people. So one of the things that Hitler did was saying, we have to have a heavy propaganda push all the time. Interestingly, propaganda grows with the advent of mass media, the technology of the 20th century, the fact that newspapers can become widely distributed and printed daily fairly cheaply enough that the average person can buy them. Then radio and television. You have multiple outlets reinforcing a single message. You can imagine what happens today with social media as that channel is amplified. When Hitler started his propaganda campaign, one of the victims of it was a man by the name of Victor Klemperer. Now, who was Klemperer? Klemperer was a man of Jewish descent, although he went to a Protestant church, so he wasn't rounded up first. He could kind of pass for a while. But he was also a scholar, and he was a philologist. That's not somebody you go because, your philology is inflamed. A philologist is a person who studies the history of language. And Klemperer started making a diary to note how the Third Reich was using words and abusing words. He published them after the war in a book called The Language of the Third Reich. And he noticed certain things were consistent in the Third Reich. First of all, they didn't invent a whole bunch of new words. What they would do, though, is they would use recurrent words, buzzwords, over and over again. So there are certain words that were repeated. Don't you want to be fanatic? In the German, and it's a little bit hard to do this because the German connotations of these words are going to be different than the English. But in the German, it was fanatical. You could either be fanatically for something, I'm fanatic, like we're big fanatics of a sports team. That could be a positive, or you could be fanatic against. It meant just super engaged one way or the other. But he would push this idea over and over, what these buzzwords were. Also, there was an extended use of euphemisms by the Third Reich in order to cover or sway bad behavior. So, for example, one of the things that they published was that the war was imposed upon our peace-loving Führer. It was imposed upon us. I mean, Germany had war declared upon them by France and Britain. And that's a factually true statement. Germany did not declare war on France and Britain. France and Britain declared war on Germany. Only after Germany remilitarized their Rhineland, they annexed Austria, they annexed Czechoslovakia, they invaded Poland, and then England and France declared war on Germany. Those poor Germans, they had that war imposed upon them. Or the incommensurable hate of the Jews. Klemperer said that they used this phrase with Orwellian ambiguity. He didn't quite use the Orwellian term, but incommensurable hate is aggressive. It's conspiratorial. He said that the Jews, that's how they were acting. And then the Germans were just responding with spontaneous and legitimate hate back because of these issues. So an extended use of euphemisms. Using standard phrases to implicate motive. Attaching prefixes and suffixes also to gain acceptance or shame. Does this sound familiar at all? Something phobic. Just stick a little suffix on there. Whatever that thing is you want, just put phobic after it, and you'll understand, right? I have to say no more about it. You already get it. These are the hallmarks that he noted of propaganda. And lastly, propaganda is not organic. It's inorganic. It's controlled. Language normally changes, and sometimes when you talk with folks about the abuse of language, one of the things that they'll say is, well, language changes all the time. Of course, these words mean new things. Words have always meant new things. That's true. However, language changes organically from the grassroots level, from like the changes in the word bathroom. Nobody prescribes that. George Packer, writing in The Atlantic, had noted how the Sierra Club had put out a new diversity, equity, inclusion writing style for all of their published materials. And it was very, you can't use these words. You can't say, fat. You can't say all of the buzzwords that you hear. And he said the Sierra Club, matter of fact, the AMA, the American Heart Association, the American Psychological Association, National Recreation and Parks Association, among others, all of these guys have these guidelines, and they all seem to have the same kinds of rules, but they're pushed out for a purpose. The guide's purpose, he says, quote, is not just to make sure that the Sierra Club avoids obviously derogatory terms such as welfare queen. He says it also seeks to cleanse language of any trace of privilege, hierarchy, bias, or exclusion. And he notes that although these are very diverse organizations, most draw on the same sources from activist organizations. And he points to a progressive a progress on the racial equity tools glossary. He says, and there's a couple of others that they'll draw from. So he goes on to say, although the guides refer to language evolving, these changes are a revolution from above. They haven't emerged organically from the shifting linguistic habits of large numbers of people. They're handed down in communiques written by obscure experts who purport to speak for vaguely defined communities, remaining unanswerable to a public that's being morally coerced. And if you doubt this, just think of the term Latinx. That's making the rounds. Polls show between 90 to 98% of people of Hispanic origin hate the term. And I can understand why it would feel an affront to someone whose heritage revolves on masculine and feminine nouns to want to drop those because some white kids in Harvard want to make sure that gender doesn't be inculcated in their language. So, a public that's being morally coerced. Packer says, when the San Francisco Board of Supervisors replaces felon with justice-involved person, it's making an ideological claim that there's something illegitimate about the laws, the courts, the prisons. If you accept the change, as in certain contexts you'll surely feel you must, then you also acquiesce in the argument. Do you see the problem? That's why I wanted to make this talk, because the underlying goal of Newspeak is a way to measure your morality. It's coercing agreement with a specific position. The courts, the justice system is bad, so he's just a justice-involved person. George Packer says, what's new and perhaps more threatening about equity language is the special kind of pressure it brings to bear. The conformity it demands isn't just because it's bureaucratic, it's moral. They want you to agree to a specific moral stance. Now, I want to give you the three kind of categories that I've identified in language abuse today. And we'll talk about these. These are kind of the tricks of the language traps. And you'll probably recognize them as I mention each. The first one, emotion. And I think these are in your book, in your pamphlets. You have emotion, equivocation, and obfuscation. So let's go through each one separately. First is emotion. The word illegal has a connotation, well, it doesn't have a connotation, it has a denotation of guilt associated with it, right? Illegal, alien. Well, you can't call them that. You know, you're shaming those people. They're just trying to make a better life for themselves. They're undocumented. Oops, left them at home. Now, this doesn't work. There's no consistency in this. This is one of the ways that you find this out. For example, if you talk about people in Africa who are going out and hacking the faces off of elephants or rhinoceroses for their tusks, for their horns, which happens, it's a tragedy. These big animals are either defaced or basically left for dead because the ivory or the rhino horn can sell for many times the amount that it would take to gather it. These poachers, illegal poachers, will be called illegal. They're not just undocumented animal collectors, right? You don't undocumented. Well, he's just an undocumented animal collector. That's all he is. It doesn't work for that, but it works in a context of a political argument. Now, maybe we should deal with the problems and the causes that have so many people looking for a better life over our border. I think we have to have a discussion about that. But changing the language doesn't help us because it sets up a polarization, just like the Black Lives Matter set up a polarization. Hobo. Remember the hobos? Do we have hobos anymore? I think we might. They used to be called bums. He's a bum on the street, my grandfather. Don't be a bum. So we went from hobo to bum to homeless. He's just homeless. That's the only difference. Oh, you can't call him homeless. He's unhoused. Do you see the euphemism treadmill in action? What's the real problem? The real problem is there's an individual that is doing something counter to productive society. Some need help. Some refuse help. But we can't change the language to change the condition. All you're doing is masking it, using emotion to try and get around those unsavory feelings. Shaming terms. Oh, you can't say that, it's bigoted. You must be a bigot. Are you a bigot? Are you homophobic? Are you genderphobic? Are you phobic? I don't know. You're ableist. You're fat shaming. You're a cis, whatever. Oh, prefixes and suffixes. You're a hate group. You see the emotiveness tied to those words and how they make a difference? That's called a logical fallacy. That's appealing to pity is the informal fallacy's name, but it's a logical fallacy. And if you're in a class in logic, your argument would fail. Here's another logical fallacy, equivocation. Equivocation is when you use the same word in two different contexts, meaning two different things, but you try and say it means the same thing. So, for example, the word love. Love is love. How many of you have heard love is love? That sounds good. Well, I love my wife. I also love chicken cacciatore. Now, if I say love is love, I love my wife, and that means I love my wife like I love my chicken cacciatore. I'm not going home tonight. And I'm definitely not getting any chicken cacciatore made. I know that. That's for sure. I love to ride my bicycle. All three of those things use the same word, but uses them in different contexts. And we see this happen over and over again. A lot of times it's done by folks who are trying to either make it sound scientific or dodge the science. So gender. Gender. That's a big one today. And I find a lot of Christians falling into this. A lot of Christians are using the term gender when actually they mean sex. See, we are born body and soul. We have a sex. That's a biological aspect of who we are. There are two sexes. Whether or not you can reproduce, whether or not you have an XXY or an XYY chromosome, you also have to always admit that there are only two gametes used in reproduction, a male gamete and a female gamete. There's no third thing. You may have a defective gamete, or you may have a genetic condition that causes you an extra chromosome, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not male or female. In fact, those very, very, very small cases where you do have XXY or XYY, things are maybe just X, missing a chromosome, you're talking about less than 0.01%, and they're still identified as, the biology would show that you're still either male or female. It's just a defection in what would have normally been developed. It's like saying, because there are individuals who are born with 6 fingers on their hands, we can't classify them as human because all humans have 5 fingers on each hand. Well, that doesn't make any sense at all. Or identify as. What do you identify as? Now, this is, again, this Gnostic idea seems to be creeping in all the time. Do you identify as? How do you identify as something? What does that mean? Matter of fact, I read a Christianity Today article where they actually used the term. Do you identify as a Christian? I went, I don't identify as a Christian. I am a Christian. Do you identify as being alive? We are a new creation in Christ. All things have passed away, all things have become new. That's a fact. Interesting, they don't say, do you identify as gay? They say, you are gay. That's the fact. But what you identify as gender-wise, well, that's up for grabs. See, it's Gnostic. It's the idea that you somehow sit above your body. You somehow sit above the created order, and you can choose to shape it and reshape it. You can't do that for existence. I identify as being non-existent. I identify as being debt-free. I wrote that to my credit card company. They didn't seem to care. Structural, institutionalized racism. Here's a good string of equivocations. What's a structure? What's an institution? And how are they racist? When somebody says that's structural racism, what do you say? How do you respond? Ooh, I'm behind on my slides, I'm sorry. Here's John McWhorter, who's a linguist. He also happens to be black. But in this case, he wrote this at the New York Times. He says, systems, structures, and institutions cannot be racist any more than they can be happy or sad. They can be made up of individuals who share these traits, sure, or even have procedures that may engender them. But systems, structures, and institutions do not themselves have feelings or prejudices. He goes on to say, and here's the thing, one might formally understand that. Well, let me back up. There's a quote where he says, the low number of black kids in a school that maybe the lady down the street is complaining about, well, yeah, that's something that we need to fix. But it is probably safe to say that no one in the school would disagree. The reason for the low numbers is not anyone's bigotry. Now, the reason is indeed legacies of what bigotry created in the past. There's ripples from certain actions. Poverty and its effects, parents who work too hard and don't have much time to help their kids in their schoolwork as others do, lack of inherited wealth to outlay the problem. I think all of those matter. I think fatherlessness is the primary driver in much of this, and something that goes unmentioned more often than not. But then he says, but here's the thing, that one might formally understand that, all those reasons, but this slack-jawed anger that many, such as the woman he was confronted by, have about systemic racism, that's not anger at about 1960, about those past prejudices and those past legal actions. He says, it is, even if it is tacitly based on a sense that this systemic racism, i.e. that what we must battle is something going on by the name of racism that exists in the here and now. It's a present tense phenomenon. And both, it's that thing, it's the here and now that enrages and disgusts us. And I think he's right. So you hear the term systemic racism, institutionalized racism, and you picture in your mind a wall that's there today. You picture Jim Crow laws today. Matter of fact, even the term Jim Crow has taken a connotative value of its own. That's why it was thrown around in the Georgia elections so recently. Even though you had the highest black turnout of any modern election in Georgia. Now, nobody apologizes after the fact for that. That's equivocation. Lastly, obfuscation. What obfuscation means is to blur definitions. So we don't quite know what we're talking about. We can kind of pour whatever we want in there. But when we start getting definitive, that's when the problems come in. So tolerance, for example. What does tolerance mean? What does it actually mean? If I have a pebble in my shoe and I'm racing to, say, catch a train or catch a plane or something like that, I might complain to my wife, oh, I got this thing in my shoe. Well, do we need to stop? No, we're going to miss the flight. I can tolerate it. Let's just keep going. Tolerance means I don't like it, but I'll allow it. That's always what tolerance has meant. Now, tolerance means not merely do you have to say, okay, it's there, I recognize it, but I don't like it. You have to say, no, we celebrate you. We vaunt you. We hold you up in high regard. Diversity, equity, inclusion are words like this. What does diversity mean? What kind of diversity? Should we start taking skin tone samples at every college campus to make sure that we have the right percentages? Is that the thing that matters? Why do we want diversity in that regard? How about diversity of thought? Because the stats are clear that in most universities today, there's only one side of the political aisle that's being represented. George Packer, in the Atlantic again, says, "What are diversity, equity, and inclusion but abstractions with uncertain meanings whose repetition creates an artificial consensus and muddies clear thought? When a university administrator refers to an individual student as diverse, oh, you're diverse. I thought I was whole." The word has lost contact with anything tangible, and that's the point. The whole tendency of equity language is to blur the contours of hard, often unpleasant facts. The aversion to reality is its main appeal. Once you acquire the vocabulary, it's actually easier to say people with limited financial resources than, say, the poor. The first rolls off your tongue without interruption, leaves no aftertaste, arouses no emotion. The second is rudely blunt. It's bitter. It might make someone angry or sad. Yeah, imprecise language is less likely to offend. But good writing, vivid imagery, strong statements, those will hurt because it's bound to convey painful truths. And they know this. And that's why, even in their own terms, they obfuscate. I had a hard time titling this talk because I wanted to communicate that I'm seeing a lot of this in our culture today, specifically pushed primarily on one side of the aisle, only because that one side of the aisle holds the megaphones to most of the major media outlets. It's not that the right doesn't do it. The right absolutely does it as well. And I've seen that, and we have to be careful of that. But at least the right will define its terms. What is woke? Woke, now I'm reading folks coming and say, well, woke has been a term appropriated by the right, and so we can't use it anymore. Don't call me as woke. Well, what are you? Please define what you are. I would love to talk to you about it. Liberal was batted around the same way about a few years ago. When people started associating liberal, the word liberal, with the terms and the policies of those on the left, liberal became a dirty word. And the liberals started complaining that the word that they had used for themselves is a dirty word. But they won't define what they are. Critical race theory. I hear challenges all the time, and I'm sure Monique's going to cover some of this. Yeah, people throw around the charge of critical race theory all the time, but nobody knows how to define it. I know how to define it. It's a system of oppressor where you primarily understand personal motivation through an oppressor and oppressed class, where the victimized are intentionally or unintentionally through a long series of history kept oppressed through the systems that are in place. That's the primary understanding of how the world works. But they won't define it. It's a critical race theory isn't taught in schools. Or they'll define it too narrowly. They'll say critical race theory, that's a legal stratagem that was taught in colleges, and there's no way in elementary school they're teaching these kinds of things, and they'll try and quote Kimberly Crenshaw and things like that. Okay, fine. Critical race praxis, how's that? The effects of critical race theory, which is what, again, this is equivocation. The effects of critical race theory, the fallout from it, is being taught throughout the curriculum that we see today. And then we have pronoun trouble. Anybody remember this? This is a great cartoon. I wanted to get the clip, but I couldn't find it. I just didn't have enough time. It was late. Rabbit season, duck season, rabbit season. He doesn't have to shoot you now. Oh, yes, he does have to shoot me now. Shoot me now, right? And Daffy's. And then he goes, wait, let's go through that again. Pronoun trouble. That's where we find ourselves today. Now, here's my first question. When people say, you have to use my preferred pronouns. You've heard this. My first question is, what makes them yours? What makes them yours? See, if we're talking about language, pronouns are an aspect of language. Remember, that's how we started. Language is an agreed upon meaning of words within a society, specific reference. If I said red means go and green means stop, and you have to believe that, there's going to be a whole lot of confusion and chaos on the roads today, right? Especially if not everybody adopts it. There's the old story of the guy, young kid with his friend driving in the car, right? And he sees the light turns red, right through the intersection. Guys, what are you doing? He goes, don't worry about this. My brother does it all the time. Driving, second red light, solid as can be, right through the intersection. Man, you're crazy. Don't worry about it. My brother does it all the time. Third signal, sure enough, turns green. He stops. Well, what are you doing now? Oh, my brother might be coming the other way. Yeah. If you don't have an agreed upon meaning, then you can't have language. You're not communicating. If you have a specialized usage of words whose meaning is contingent only on the person using it, I say my pronouns are X. Well, that's not language. That's code. That's what codes are. Substituting something common for something, or substituting something uncommon for something common. And that's what I find out we're doing today. What makes them your pronouns? You don't get to change language for just yourself. We're all talking about this together. The problem with obfuscation, how many of you have been called evangelical kind of with a spit in the throat? Okay? Now, here's an interesting thing. Ask them to define what an evangelical is. I'll ask you guys to define what an evangelical is. Most people can't. Most people think if you go to church and are Republican, that makes you an evangelical. And that's just craziness. The problem with obfuscation, though, is it has the opposite effect, ultimately, than what even the reformers want. Packer summarized his article by saying, the guides that are being changed for equity language want to make the ugliness of our society disappear by linguistic fiat. But even by their own lights, they do more ill than good, not because of their absurd bans on ordinary words like congresswoman or expat, or the self-torture they require of conscientious users, but because they make it impossible to face squarely the wrongs they want to right. Because you're not seeing that ugliness clearly in the language, you can't have any change. Okay, how to diffuse loaded language. And I'm going to give you two ideas. First is engage and extend, and the second, specification and clarification. Now, remember Jason Reynolds? I gave you this quote. My life matters, Black Lives Matter. My life matters, and if you say no, all lives matter, what I would say is I believe you'd believe all lives matter. I know for a fact that based on the numbers, my life hasn't mattered. Now, I cheated you on this because I didn't give you the entire quote. Here's the rest of it. I know for a fact that my life doesn't matter. That black women's lives definitely haven't mattered. That black trans people's lives haven't mattered. That black gay people's lives haven't mattered. That immigrants' lives don't matter. That Muslims' lives don't matter. That indigenous people of this country's lives have never mattered. I mean, we could go on and on and on. So when I say all lives, are we talking about white lives? If so, then let's just say that because it's coded language. So that's his full quote. Now you see a little bit more of the problem. While he wants you to say Black Lives Matter, not all lives matter. People pull back because there's an entire political set of baggage that comes along with that phrase, especially if you understand the organization that spawned it. How do we, A, not take that on in tacit agreement? Yes, Black Lives Matter. Okay, you're one of us. That means you hold to trans people and hold that we're killing Muslims, not Muslims killing us, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How do you do this? Engage and extend. So if somebody comes up to me and says, will you say Black Lives Matter? You know what I say? I draw on my Christian roots and I say, I'll go farther than that. I will say black lives have inestimable worth. That black lives are image bearers from the Creator who have a value above anything else and should be saved at all costs. I've sidestepped the politics by saying that. Nobody thinks I'm a Black Lives Matter supporter or I'm donating to their cause or I'm agreeing with their list of litanies, but I'm affirming them, which is really what the central point is. And, sneakily enough, if I say, you bear God's image, that means you're accountable and responsible to God for your actions. Now, what's that mean? Can we have a conversation? Engage and extend. Homosexual gay lifestyle. Are you condemning me because I live the gay lifestyle? And I've always thought that a strange term. I'm a homosexual. I'm gay. Are you gay or are you a human being? If you come up to somebody and you would say, can you tell me the two most valuable aspects of who you are? Is it really going to be their sexual proclivities? Is that what you want to hold up as your defining attribute? Something that you do for 30 minutes twice a week? How can that be all you are? That's the least of who you are. Animals copulate. You're a human being. You're going to be so much more intricate and complex than that. Don't you think? Wouldn't you agree with me there? As a human being, there's certain things we should do and certain things we shan't do, and we talk about that. But what would you say are your main benefits, your main traits? Do you see how engage and extend takes the heat off? It's not an agree or disagree. You're splitting the horns of the dilemma. So, engage and extend. Secondly, ask for specification and clarification. The famous phrase, what do you mean by that? Can you please explain it to me? Of course, the most famous aspect of this was put forth by Matt Walsh. What is a woman? You go on a college campus, start asking that question. That seems to be a simple question. What does gender mean? What do you mean I'm gendered? I'm a female gender. I'm a male. What does that entail? What can you do or what can't you do because you're gendered this way? If you're a female gender, does that mean that you can't wear pants, have to wear dresses? Does that mean that you can't become a mathematician or study for NASA? What does that mean? Does that mean that all the Scotsmen who are male gender have to get rid of their kilts? See, people aren't born with a gender. People are sexed. Gender is something French nouns have. Gender is an attitude or a proclivity, right? So you can have a masculine action, and all that means is we see more men doing it than women. It's a stereotype. It's a generality. But people themselves are not born with a gender, and they aren't identified as a gender by a doctor, assigned. That's another one of those buzzwords, right? That's an emotive word. You're assigned at birth. You didn't get to do that. Somebody pushed it onto you. What does that mean? What structures specifically are you talking about that are racist? Can you tell them to me? Now, I agree that there's a difference between institutionalized racism and structural racism. A structural racism, so an institution could be, say, a law court or a university that had traditionally been racist in its rulings and admissions. That's an institution. But the education system, that would be a systemic. And you're going to have to prove that every aspect of that educational system is influenced the way that university, that structure is. So what do you mean by that? Pronoun trouble. Let's go back to that. Okay, well, can we have a conversation about pronouns? So there's a pronoun that you're asking I should adopt. Well, Lenny Esposito uses second-person pronouns instead of third-person ones or first-person ones. So when you address Lenny Esposito, you have to say I and me, and you and your are for the person who's doing the addressing. How would that work? Normally, okay, let me unpack this a little bit. So normally you'd say, I gave this to you, right? No, you can't use that. Or I gave this to her, not her, them. Well, that's a plural. And so what if I said, I gave this to me? Because if you're giving something to Lenny Esposito, you have to use the me pronoun for the second person change instead of the third person. Right? They want us to change our third person pronouns. Him, her, its. Those are the ones that they want us to change. Only the third person in the pronoun. First person is self-reflective, I. Second person is talking to an individual. And third person is those group over there. They say you got to change that third person, her or he, to sie or zer or them. I'm saying, well, if you can change third person pronouns, you can change first and second person pronouns too. So we have the Daffy and Bugs thing going on again. So if you're going to say you're stupid, no, you got to say I'm stupid instead. And if you're going to say I'm right, no, you got to say you're right. By the same rules, using the same logic. You see the problem. Okay. Ultimately, though, in our communication, the primary communication is the gospel. That's what we're going for. Charles Stevenson, philosopher on language, said, the profanities of yesterday may become the parlor terms of tomorrow in our culture. So fighting over individual words is important because we have to try and communicate, but it's not the hill to die on. The hill to die on is to get around the fight. That's why I like ideas like engage and extend, because it puts a spin on things that people haven't even thought about yet. How do I do that? As a person who's valued by God, who's gonna say, well, that's an insult? You just can't do it. You can grow them into the gospel. You can say, I hear you. I understand your pain. Yes, the lady who's seen all of the kids on her street either turn to gangs in the inner city or half of them lose their lives or go to jail. She's heartbroken, and that's real. You can't dismiss her by saying all lives matter because, frankly, I can understand why she's offended. But you can't necessarily agree with the political movement that's going to cause that problem to increase. How do we get her to the gospel? We point her to the creation and say, how can we together understand this issue and try and unpack it? But in order to do that, we have to communicate. And in order to communicate, we have to use language fairly. Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.